So today, the topic is how you contextualize research problems. I was teaching this course a few years back, and we had a good discussion about research questions and problem statements. And so the people that were in that URAW course actually wrote this presentation based on the discussion we had. So I just thought I would share that with you. They drafted this and shared it with me. So what we determined was um, research questions are not going to be yes or no questions. They don't have simple answers. And sometimes the answer is not just going to be a simple fact. Some research questions may grow out of experience working or studying within a certain field, discipline, or subject area, and I think they should. And they often rise in response to a need. And then there are different research problems. One is that there are practical problems. Practical problems have a solution that can be implemented. Let's say we're all engineers and we work for a company that manufactures cars, automobiles. And let's say that our company manufactures a sports car. It's really flashy, it looks attractive, it goes fast, and it's expensive. And next year, we want our sports car to look the same. We want it to go just as fast. We want it to accelerate as fast. We want it to have the same top speed. We want to have the same performance, but we want it to use less fuel. That's a practical research problem, right? Well, what do y'all think? How would you make this car use less fuel? If we were responsible for altering the design of the car in order to make it use less fuel, what types of research questions would we ask?
We may probably think about different uh, technologies, maybe more fuel efficient technologies, maybe hybrid systems.
Okay, great. So, one of our research questions, if this was our research problem, the problem is we need to make this car more fuel efficient. One of our research questions would be what kind of technologies out there might assist with that? Is it possible to use a hybrid system? And does the hybrid system allow for the same performance? Okay, that would be one question. And then we would have to go and do research about that to find out what the answer was. And we might come back and say, we don't want to use the hybrid system because it sacrifices performance. Or after doing the research, we might come back and say, okay, one thing we can do is to implement a hybrid system so it uses some electricity and some fuel, gas. Okay. Can you think of any other questions you might ask on how would you make the sports car more fuel efficient?
Well, we may work on decreasing power dissipation. There can be a question about how to decrease power dissipation in the cars.
Exactly. Yes. Excellent example. All right. So, how would we decrease power dissipation? What kinds of things could we do to decrease power dissipation? And then that would lead to other questions. Okay. Would changing the exhaust system decrease power dissipation or not? If so, how? Would changing the gear system when the engine's power is translated into gears that turn the wheels, if we change the gear system, would that decrease power dissipation? If so, how? Sadia Malik says, what kind of fuels could we use? All right, maybe that would be another question. Are there alternative fuels? Could we go from regular octane gasoline to premium octane gasoline? Is it possible to go from gasoline to diesel fuel? And those are the types of things we would research. We could say, how do we make the car weigh less? Can we replace steel with titanium? Titanium is lighter than steel. Does titanium have the same strength as steel? Can parts that were originally steel be made from titanium and be just as strong but weigh less so that the car is less heavy? That would be another question. Okay. Another question is, can we slightly modify the exterior design to make it more aerodynamic? So these are all questions that we could have that would help us solve our research problem. Got some other examples: impact design and seating capacity, non-fuel car efficiency. Yeah, see, these are excellent questions that we could ask if we were engineers and if it was our job to solve a practical research problem about making a car more fuel efficient without changing its performance. But conceptual problems are a little bit different. They don't even have a solution sometimes. Sometimes it's just about the development of abstract ideas. Conceptual problems can be very philosophical in nature. Let's say we're reading Shakespeare and we're reading the play Hamlet. It's Shakespeare's longest play, and it's probably one of his most famous. On the surface, it's a historical story about a prince who he believes his father was murdered, and he wants to get revenge on the people that murdered his father and took the throne. And yet, in his religious beliefs, it is a sin to take revenge. He should allow God to punish the wicked and not try to do so himself. But then he starts asking all these philosophical questions about that. And then he starts asking, how, what if God wants me to be his instrument of punishment? And, ultimately, Hamlet turns out to be wrong. And the point of the story is it's a tragedy. And the point of the story is to point out his own moral flaws. But when we start analyzing something like Hamlet, yes, to be or not to be is one of his famous soliloquies. And in that particular speech, he contemplates suicide, which is also a sin in his religion. But he contemplates these philosophical ideas, and he finds himself in a situation where he is misled and he believes that he's made the best choice in the resolutions he's come to involving those philosophical ideas. So what that allows us to do when we read the play is it allows us to contemplate those same philosophical ideas, and it allows us to contemplate whether the story or whether Shakespeare is trying to make a moral statement through telling this story, or whether there's a certain definitive answer about who was right and who was wrong in their interpretation of different philosophical ideas. And so that is a conceptual problem. We can argue about it all day, and people have argued about Hamlet for centuries, and people just still don't agree on exactly what the final meaning of it is. That's a conceptual problem. So we could ask, for example, is the play Hamlet Shakespeare's critique of Catholic ideas of divine justice versus human justice? Well, there's no yes or no answer to that. There's no right or wrong answer to that. There are theories that Shakespeare may have been secretly Catholic. At the time when he wrote, there was a lot of anti-Catholic sentiment. So we could analyze the philosophical sort of meaning of Hamlet to try and say maybe Shakespeare is critiquing Catholic theological ideas, or maybe he is himself secretly Catholic and he's trying to express those theological ideas. Well, there's no set answer to that. We could talk about it all day. Some people might believe one way, some people might believe another. There's evidence in the text to support both of them. And so that's a conceptual problem, right? Shamila has a good point too, the psychoanalysis of Hamlet. So Hamlet is one of the famous plays that has been subjected to psychoanalytical criticism, right? There's a lot more than just theological ideas in the play. There's a lot of epistemological ideas in the play. There's a lot of ideas. There's a lot of times Hamlet is questioning his identity and who he is, and there's a lot of emotional interactions between him and his mother and him and his father's ghost. And so there's lots of opportunities to psychoanalyze Hamlet. But that would also amount to conceptual research problems, right? And those are the ones we're probably mostly going to be dealing with. Y'all are coming up with some great possible paper topics for Hamlet, correlations between psychological state and religious beliefs in Hamlet. And that is actually a really good way to look at it, because he is, well, first of all, he's seeing ghosts. Okay. He keeps seeing this ghost of his father. When we're watching the play or reading the play, we have no idea whether he's hallucinating that, whether it's truly a real ghost or not. Conflict between fate and free will. He has some soliloquies about that too. Yeah. There are times when it almost seems like he knows that he's a character in a play. Yes. Questions of justice and morality, killing Claudius, recontextualization of Hamlet in a different cultural and historical context. That's another really interesting one too. I've seen that in some movie remakes of Hamlet. I've seen some movies where they would put Hamlet into a modern day time. and his father's not a king but owns some big company. And the plot of Hamlet actually goes all the way back to ancient Greek drama, and there's a series of plays called the Oresteia, and the plays are about exactly the same story as Hamlet. The father, who's a king, is killed by his. In Hamlet, it's his own brother, but in the Greek plays, it's his cousin. In either case, the brother or the cousin marries the wife, who's the mother of the hero. And in both cases, Orestes is the Greek hero. He has to go home, and in Greek mythology, the gods are telling him that it's his duty to avenge his father's death. And he has to go and kill his uncle, but he has to kill his mother as well because she was complicit in murdering his father. And so he does so, and he kills his uncle and his mother. And then there are some older gods who want to punish him for killing his parent, and the newer gods who say, well, no, he has to avenge his father's death, even if it was his mother who killed his father. So that created a moral dilemma in ancient Greek tragedy. And in their religious views, that dilemma could not be solved. They were equally valid points. And so he has to go to the temple of Athena and be judged in the Greek plays. Okay. Hamlet is a recontextualization of that ancient Greek play. Well, depends on which writer you read, but the original one is three. The oldest one is a series of three plays, the Oresteia. So what Shakespeare did was he found a historical text about the history of Denmark, and it had a scenario where, indeed, there was a king who was murdered by his brother. The brother married the mother, and then the son killed his uncle and assumed the throne. So he took that history and he took the ancient Greek play and he put them in a new context, in the context of his own time. And he took them out of the religious context of ancient Greece, of ancient Athenian culture, and put it into the context of 16th century English culture, where there was a lot of tension between uh, Catholicism and Protestantism, early Protestantism, the Anglican Church. So that's a great point about recontextualizing the moral and philosophical and theological ideas, because that's exactly what Shakespeare did. But see, researching those things again, these are conceptual problems. Just because you write a convincing article or even book about Hamlet discussing all of those things, it doesn't mean that everyone's going to read the play the same way. It doesn't mean that there's no more need to read the play anymore because you've solved the riddle behind it. You've answered all the questions. No, there's still going to be thousands of other ways to interpret the play, thousands of different ways to analyze it and understand it, thousands of different ways to recontextualize it and remake it into film or remake it into theater. Fakhra says there was an Indian movie that was an adaptation of Hamlet set in Kashmir. Oh, that looks really interesting. I would love to see that. I'll have to look that up. But anyways, I think you get the point, right? There are these conceptual problems. It's really worthwhile doing research on conceptual problems, but not because you're going to get a specific answer. There's not because you're ever going to find a solution. In fact, some of the reasons that it's good to do research on conceptual problems is because there is no solution, and it's the working with the ideas, the development of thought, the development of thinking, and the contemplation of these deeper ideas and issues, and that has value, as opposed to practical research problems where there is an actual solution. Will this medicine cure that disease? Can these different modifications to a car make it more fuel efficient without sacrificing its performance? How can we make computers use less power and still have the same computing power? What kind of alternative energy sources might we find to provide electricity and power to everyone without the cost or the environmental impact of the ones that we're using? Those are all practical problems They have solutions. Sometimes some solutions are better than others. Sometimes one solution is good enough for now and it leads to another solution later, but they have solutions, and conceptual problems usually don't. So when we make problem statements, we want to essentially allow our readers to see what is the research problem that we're dealing with. So how do we make problem statements? So we've already seen how some problem statements have multiple research questions attached, right? So it might be helpful to think about problem statements as a bundle or a batch of connected research questions. So problem statements can grow out of large numbers of research questions that are somehow all related to one another. And problem statements can also generate new research questions. When we think about problem statements, we might want to ask ourselves, why is this urgent? Why is it a problem? Why do I need to research this? That's going into the sort of motivation for the research, the motivation for the problem statement, and its relationship to all the research questions. Okay. But also a good research problem or a good problem statement, in other words, the portion of your piece of writing, whether it's an article or a book or a proposal or whatever it is that you're writing, that expresses your research problem. You don't have to put a heading that says, hey, problem statement, but you can do that. You don't have to, but you need something somewhere that communicates to your readers what your research problem is. And we call that the problem statement. And in that problem statement, it can be very helpful to establish common ground. Okay. So we just brought up this. It was interesting. I brought this question of how do we make a car more fuel efficient, and took several minutes before anyone wanted to answer. And that's probably just because, we're all either humanists or social scientists, I believe. I don't think we have any engineers in this group. Um, and so those are kinds of questions that we don't usually ask when we do research, right? If we're not engineers. So I asked, hey, what do you think? What kind of questions would you ask to solve this research problem about fuel efficient cars? And it felt like everyone was a little bit reluctant to answer. Then we got a couple answers going, but it was interesting to see how as soon as I started talking about Hamlet, tons of brilliant suggestions started coming up in the chat group, right? That's because we have common ground. Okay. Common ground is the sort of, let's call it the intellectual boundaries of the space that you share with people that are in your field or in related fields. When I bring up Hamlet, when I bring up the philosophical and theological themes in Hamlet, and then you bring up considering different cultural contexts and placing the similar plot into different cultural contexts, we have common ground because there are several of us in this group that research literature. And even if we're into psychology or linguistics, there is still some overlap with that when it comes to literature. So there's common ground, right? Things that you understand, things that you work on, things that you contemplate, and things that I contemplate that makes my question relevant to you, that makes my research interesting to you and relevant to your research. Establishing common ground. I'll bring this example up later, but I'll share it here. If I were to say, although widely considered Pushkin's most prolific period of creativity, the Boldino Autumn, being a period when he produced many of his greatest works, should not be thought of as a defined period of time, because many of his works he had either begun or begun thinking about prior to that time. Does anyone have any idea what I'm talking about?
Well, you're
So,
talking about the poet.
yeah, the
Pushkin?
poet. Yep.
Now, I don't exactly know he was the national poet of Russia or what status he had in the poetry of Russia.
Yeah, he is their most celebrated poet. The reason I brought this example up is a lot of people know who Pushkin was in terms of the fact that they know he was a Russian poet, but I was talking about the Boldino Autumn. And if you're a Pushkin scholar, the Boldino Autumn is a very, very famous event that happened in Pushkin's life. And what happened was he was traveling and there was a cholera outbreak and he got stuck in this village called Boldino because there was a quarantine and he wasn't allowed to leave. And he was stuck there for a few months. And he couldn't leave the inn that he was staying in. And so while he was there, he just sat down and started writing, and he produced multiple masterpieces in that one period of time. Now, if you don't study Pushkin, that probably doesn't mean anything to you, and there's no reason it should. But if you do study Pushkin, then you know exactly what that is, exactly what year it was, exactly what months it was, exactly what masterpieces he wrote during that time period. And you also know that most Pushkin scholars just consider this some sort of strange, miraculous time where he was able to produce all these masterpieces within just a few weeks. Now, that's common ground, okay? What I have done, if I were to make a statement like that, I would be establishing common ground between me and other scholars of Pushkin. And I wrote my dissertation on Pushkin, so that's why I bring up that example. I wrote my PhD dissertation on Shakespeare, Pushkin, and Voltaire. And so I would be establishing common ground with other Pushkin scholars. I wouldn't necessarily care if other people don't know what that is, because I would be writing for an audience of Pushkin scholars, because my research project would be claiming that Pushkin actually had begun working on those masterpieces before he got stranded. So he did not just complete them all in that one time period. So I would be trying to object to the common beliefs in that field about that particular incident in that particular poet's life. So my common ground would be indicating that this particular piece of research is for those scholars who research that very highly specialized topic or subject. Okay. So that's what common ground does. It kind of defines the intellectual space in which your research is being done. And it also helps define who your intended audience is, right? By making your intended audience, by signaling to people who are in your same field of expertise, or who are interested in the same kind of research topics you do, that this is something that you're researching in order to contribute to a conversation with them. Now, that's not the same as using jargon, but jargon can do the same similar things. It can identify and isolate an audience, but establishing common ground does that too. So then, you know, after you base your research problem on your research questions and you see that it's giving rise to new research questions, you establish a common ground in the section of your writing that we call the problem statement. And after that, then you specify or identify what the problem is. Okay. Often the problem might be a gap of knowledge or an inadequate amount of research. In the example I gave about the Boldino Autumn, it's challenging widely held beliefs about particular works that Pushkin wrote and about his creative process when he actually started working on them and when he finished them. All right. So research problems will often, again, just to reiterate, attempt to fill a gap of knowledge in your field, attempt to supply new research when there is not enough research on a certain topic or issue. It may attempt to correct what you view as misunderstandings or mistakes. Okay. There may be, let's say, some very influential research that has influenced how other people start to think about research topics. And you might want to go back to that influential research. And if you think that there are methodological flaws in it, that could mean that that research was actually wrong. And so it was all the rest of the research based on it, right? So you could be pointing out flaws in previous research. Okay, an example of this in linguistics is there was a Swiss linguist who's not widely considered one of the fathers of structuralism in linguistics, and his name was Ferdinand de Saussure, and he didn't actually write these things himself. He had given a bunch of lectures, and his students wrote down the ideas that he expressed in his lectures. And so we don't know exactly how he would have written his own theories out, but the theory as it comes to us is that there's an arbitrary relationship between a signifier, and let's call that, let's say, for example, a word, and the thing that it signifies. Okay, so in English, the word tree is a signifier, or the sound tree is a signifier, and the plant, the flora, whether it's a mango tree or an oak tree or any other type of tree, those life forms are the signifieds, the thing that that sound represents. And Saussure says there's absolutely no relationship between the sound tree and the object that it represents. If we look at German, the word for tree is Baum. Similarly, there's absolutely no relationship between that sound and the nature of a tree. Дерево is the word for tree in Russian. No relationship whatsoever to that sound and the object tree. Okay, that makes sense. Without that theory, a lot of structuralist linguistics would never been able to proceed, because separating the sounds from the things that they refer to allows you to actually start to isolate those sounds and analyze how they work in language without being distracted by, well, yeah, but it means tree, or there must be some connection between that sound and some aspect of a tree, right? So that was helpful for the advancement of linguistics. The problem with it is there's absolutely no scientific evidence at all that it's true. Just because you can't uh, just because you can't see a connection between a sound and an object doesn't mean there isn't one. Furthermore, there are words where we are 100% certain that there is a connection between the sound and the meaning of the word. Okay? Screech in English is supposed to sound like the sound that it describes. Bump. Okay? Skid. So there are examples of words that are onomatopoeic, yes, or onomatopoetic, and usually they'll describe sounds or things like that. And yet there are some others too, where there are historical connections between sounds, and sounds being mispronounced when they go from one language or another, but having some ultimate root where they do have a relationship with the thing that they're supposed to represent. So the point here is that there's evidence of signifiers that do have a relationship with the signified, but there's no evidence that proves a lack of a relationship, right? So if one wanted to, one could go back and argue against that theory. That would be a research problem that was addressing what you would consider, perhaps a flawed theory that a lot of other developments in linguistics were based on, right? So those are the types of things that research problems do. They justify your research, okay? And in your problem statement, you want language that argues in favor of the need for your research, right? Things like, it is therefore necessary to examine this more closely, or we should therefore reconsider, or because this lacuna exists in the field, we need to conduct these surveys and collect this data, right? So the whole point of your research problem is in some degree argumentative, because you want to justify the endeavors you're going to take to solve that research problem, or if it's a conceptual problem, to contemplate it and to address those research questions. Okay. Now, none of this can happen without context, right? And that context is often going to be the other research that surrounds your topic in your field, or the research in your field that has led you to ask questions that no one else has yet asked. So why is this gap evident? How did you come to see that this gap exists if you're addressing the gap of knowledge, right? If you're addressing the need to uh, further develop ideas or to reconsider old ideas that might have led the field astray, then you might want to ask yourself, who deals with these types of research problems? Who else has tried to solve them? You may have people have done similar research, but not the exact same research. You may have people who've done similar research, but you're not satisfied with the answers they came up with. You're not satisfied with the results of their research. You might not be satisfied with their methodologies. So who are these people? What did their research say? And that's where you get your context. Okay, so Sadia Malik says that she published an article on brand names from the perspective of linguistic iconicity, having direct relationship between words representing something concrete about the product. Oh, cool. So see, that would be uh, a good example of a research project that would be that that you could use. All right, let me rephrase this. That would be a good example of a research project in which the problem statement, in theory, could have brought up Saussure and his theory about the arbitrariness of the signifier and the signified, and used that to provide context to the problem statement. Not that that would be 100% necessary in that project, but his theory would provide some of the context that you could put into a problem statement about a topic like that. So thank you for sharing that. That provides a good example. Okay. And then the other thing about your problem statement is it should set up what your main argument is going to be. And your main argument in your research is essentially going to be that your methodologies have produced results that either you feel are robust and strong, or you know that have produced the results that you got, right? And that those results are the uh, the best possible results that could be gotten from your methodologies, right? So you make your research is going to make a principal claim that your whole overarching research project supports, and the problem statement sets that claim up. It shows the context in which the research was done, and it helps justify the methodologies, and it helps justify what you come up with as your final results. Even if you do acknowledge limitations in your study, the problem statement sets up that final result that you got, right? Okay, so that is a little bit about problem statements and putting them into context. Any comments or questions about that?
Yes, Dr. Avan, I have a question. Can you hear me, please?
Yes, sir, I can hear you.
Okay, thank you very much. Regarding the conceptual, question, as you said that there is no definite solution. And then on the next slide, it was written that we need to address it, that it is urgent. So how we can relate the two things that, on one side, we do not have any definite solution. And on the other side, how we can, give it a concrete format to address it that it is urgent. And the second thing is that considering common grounds, shall that be implied, or talking about the problem, since it does not have any definite solution, so it should be implied in the statement, or there should be a direct, as it was written in the example, and the fourth point, if you check that it is therefore necessary that this problem should be examined closely. So to me, it is more like a direct statement. could that be like a direct statement, or that should be in implied form as well?
Okay, thank you. Those are good
Thank you.
questions. I'm not sure who was asking because it looks like a phone number is showing up here instead of
Uh,
a name.
it is Maqsood Alam.
Okay, thank you. So those are excellent questions. First of all, when I say that it needs to be urgent, though there's a lot of different ways we can define urgency, but when we're all working in our own fields, we're following other people's research, and we're part of a community where people are in that field are all kind of thinking about similar things. And so, you know, let's say you're an English teacher in Pakistan and your field is applied linguistics. You might not feel like it's very urgent if somebody finds out whether Shakespeare's Hamlet was expressing a Catholic theology or an Anglican theology. That might not be urgent to you. It's urgent to people studying Shakespeare and the sort of history between the tension between the Catholics and the Anglicans in his time period, if you've discovered some sort of new angle or new information about it. So it would be urgent to those people in that sort of highly specialized field, but it would not necessarily be urgent to other people outside that field, right? If you're studying applied linguistics in Pakistan, something that's urgent might be new ways of using technology to teach English, or new ways of reaching people across the different regions of Pakistan that will revolutionize English teaching, or that will change the way that students access textbooks or things like that. So there could be things in that field that are urgent to that field, but they're not going to be urgent to Shakespeare scholars sitting over in Cambridge and digging through 500-year-old manuscripts. So things that are urgent, urgent is probably not the best word. I should say emergent. Okay, and I mean emergent as in new knowledge that is emerging. And there's a reason emergent and emerge are the roots of the word emergency. But we think of an emergency as a crisis. But in sort of modern English, the connotation of emergency, or the nuance, is that something, a disaster has happened and we need to respond to it right away. But the reason it's called an emergence is because as soon as something arises, if it's that type of crisis, you respond to it right away. So in your field, things that are emergent are not necessarily crises, but they are new bits of information that come out, and you're going to want to respond to that. And there will be a sense of urgency because that's how the field moves forward. As soon as there's new knowledge, people say, wow, what is that? That's interesting. That's compelling. Let me contemplate that. Let me think about that. How can I apply that to my own work? How can I apply that as a teacher? How can I apply that as a researcher? How can I respond to it as a researcher? And so you get this sense of urgency when there's new cutting edge ideas coming out in your field. So that's what I meant by urgency. I should probably say emergent rather than urgent, but that's what I meant by that. Now, regarding the common ground, I feel like common ground is implicit. It should be implied. You don't have to say this article is only for Shakespeare scholars, because you don't want to alienate people from other fields and disciplines who might still find some relevance in your work. You just want to signal that you're going to be talking about something that is within your area of specialization, and you might be highly specialized, and it might not necessarily pertain to other people, but you don't want to also isolate people and reject them from your research either. So I wouldn't be too explicit about common ground. I would be more implicit. So I would imply the common ground. And it only takes a phrase or two. Just mentioning boldly no autumn and not explaining what it is establishes common ground with Pushkin scholars, right? So uh, that's implicit, though. because other people could still read an article about that and might find it interesting. They might have to go out and learn what the Boolean element was for it to make sense to them, but they might still find it interesting. So I wouldn't want to be too overt and say this is only for Pushkin scholars. However, when the next stage of the problem statement was to justify the research, right? So you've got your basis in research questions, or your relationship between the problem statement and the research questions. That was the first ingredient, right? And then, the sort of identifying precisely what the problem is, and then providing the common ground for the problem was the third ingredient. The next one was justifying the research and using the problem statement to justify the endeavors to address those research questions. That, I would say, you can be a lot more overt about that, or explicit, in terms of, you could say it is necessary to do this, it is necessary to contemplate that, it is necessary to collect these data because, and then, of the research problem and the connected questions, right? Here we got another good question here. Should the problem statement and or research questions always be written before conducting the actual research data collection? If I go through research in a different context and want to replicate it in my context following the same tool for data collection, can I start data collection because I understand or presuppose that the research cap exists in my proposed context? So that's a great question. I read it really quickly because it's in the chat, so you can all read that. And I will upload the chat and this video to the course site also. But that's a great question. And I would say the answer is yes and no. Okay. Research is, by its nature, it's something that we don't really always understand the origins of. Okay. If you really want to split hairs and get precise, you can think back to some experience you had earlier in life that led you to be in the field you're in and to pursue the career you've pursued as a researcher, as a social scientist or a scientist or a humanist. And your research questions and problem began then, really. I mean, you don't want to put all that into your research article or your book, but really, the nature of research is that each one of us has a unique perspective on the universe. No one who has ever lived before us, no one who is alive now, and no one ever in the future will ever have the exact same perspective on the universe that each of us has. We have one unique perspective on the universe. Now, it might be very similar to someone else's perspective, but it's not exactly the same. Even twins who are born, they form together, they're born together. If they grow up together, they're going to have very similar perspectives on the universe to each other, but they're still going to be slightly different just because they're different people. They're not seeing exactly the same thing. They're not sharing one mind. So everybody has a unique perspective on the universe, and conducting research in order to acquire new knowledge is all about how you use that perspective to systematically and methodologically do work, ask questions, and answer questions that get us closer to understanding or new knowledge. Okay. And so nobody can do that exactly the same way twice. But you can try to replicate things. It's a part of the scientific method is if you want to be empirical, you try to replicate other people's results. Okay. So it's a chicken or an egg question. Which came first, the chicken or the egg? But at some point, when your ideas have developed so far that you are going to apply a methodology, you are going to collect data, and you are going to start to analyze data, you should have already had research questions. So essentially, I would say, yes, before you start your research, you should know what it is you're trying to figure out. But at the same time, you can begin developing the idea for a research project or a theoretical framework or a concept, without having explicitly or specifically written research questions. But somewhere early in the stage, you should know what kind of questions you're trying to answer. And definitely when it comes up to writing a research proposal or writing a research article, before you start that, you should definitely have your questions. Before you start doing surveys or collecting data, you should definitely have questions, because the way that you structure those surveys, the way that you design your research plan, the way that you implement your methodologies, the methodologies you choose to implement, those should be tools that are designed to answer those questions. So you may be able to come up with a concept prior to any kind of research questions or problems. But when you actually start to do research in a formal sense, you should have questions, because the methodology you choose, the theoretical framework that you employ, all of those are tools to help you solve your research problem. And your research problem is bundled up with your research question. So yes, it's a yes and no, but for more yes than no, you should have the questions before you start trying to answer them. Can research questions be changed? Yes, research questions can evolve throughout the research project, and the research topic can evolve. The research problem can evolve. But by the time you're writing an article for publication, you should have gone through all of that, and what they're going to see in that piece of writing might be the final research questions that are addressed, the most developed, refined research problem that so you won't necessarily include all the earlier iterations in your writing. Remember, the research article is there to share your research with people, but it doesn't mean that you share every little thing, right? You don't share the first time you drafted research questions. You share the final draft of the research question. So yes, they can change, especially in longer term ongoing projects, but the ones that you share by the time you publish something are the ones that you ended up with, not necessarily ones you started with. Any other comments or questions about research questions, research problems? I have so you've got to write the next assignment in this course. The first actual writing assignment is to come up with a research proposal. And so I have a research proposal that was written by a first year undergraduate student. This was a second language student from China. And she took a writing class with me. She passed the English exam to study at Boston University. This was when I used to work at Boston University. And I don't know how she passed that exam, because her English was awful and she could not speak or write a sentence. But she worked really hard, and after one semester, by the end of the semester, she was in my writing class. She was writing really good undergraduate papers for a first year student. So this paper was a research proposal she wrote in her second semester of her first year. And you can see, if you read this, I'll put this in the course site as well, you'll see that there are some minor, second language errors in it. But it's actually quite good, but for a first year student. Before I talk too much about this, there's another question in the chat. I'll just go ahead and answer it quickly. Is it necessary to refer to previous research in the problem statement? Because we're going to do the same in the literature review. The answer to that, in my opinion, is not to the same extent. What you need to do in the problem statement is put your research in context. So you can make broad generalizations in your problem statement and say, for example, nobody has ever answered these questions, or nobody has filled this gap of knowledge in our field. You don't have to prove that there's a gap of knowledge right then and there in your problem statement. You can let your literature review do that, right? Because your literature review is also another argumentative piece of writing where it's supposed to show, well, we'll talk a lot about literature reviews, but one of the things it does is it shows why your research is necessary. I do have a template I'm going to show you right after we talk about this proposal from a undergraduate student. I have a template for our level, like professional level, but I just like to show this one because it's so short, it's quick to read, it's very simple, and you can see the different elements in it that go into a research proposal, right? Now, you can see here, the problem statement appears in the first paragraph. The second paragraph asserts the need for more research. The third paragraph sort of is kind of like a tiny little miniature literature review for a first-year college student, right? It introduces some other sources in the field and comments on them in a way that shows that the research problem is still viable. Okay, and then it comes toward a solution to a lack of research in the field. And it shows an example of other ways that you can approach the problem by using sort of interdisciplinary methods. And then, kind of justifies what the research project is going to contribute. Okay. And then it just continually underscores the need for further research and establishes what the goals of the project are going to be. Okay. And then the student has an annotated bibliography, a short one of the sources that she used to do this brief proposal. And here you can see the identification, the summary, the assessment, and the statement of relevance that we talked about, the 4 ingredients for our annotations. Okay, and her annotated bibliography is specific to this research project that she proposed. Okay, so I'm going to share that with you just as an example of an undergraduate thing, an assignment that I gave. You could possibly give that type of assignment to your students if you want to, but if you do, I can share the assignment sheet with you. But it just shows in a very simple, basic way these different elements that we have to do on a more complex level. Now, yes, you can get a template for a research proposal. I will show it to you here, and I will share it on the course site. So I like to include an executive summary and a table of contents. And then when you go down into the proposal, I have in brackets things that that just say what type of thing I would put in that section. Okay. So a problem statement. And now there are a couple of questions here, like Dr. Huma is asking, shall we keep in mind certain steps, any type of formula? Yes, in the slideshow, there basically was a formula that I like to follow, but that doesn't mean that that's going to work for everyone. Sometimes Tariq says there's no explicit problem statement. Sometimes can it be replaced with a statement of purpose? Yes, like I was saying earlier, especially if you're doing like literary research, like if you're researching a literary topic, you won't have a section that says problem statement. Some proposals will have that. Some research articles will have that. Others won't. But in some places, there's no separate specific statement called a problem statement. I use that terminology, though, to refer to whatever portion of any type of research writing where your research problem is evident. Okay. It doesn't have to be something that you signpost. You don't have to create a separate section of it. In a lot of cases, in art history, in literary history, In philosophy, the problem statement is not identified. It's just built into the introduction, and it's just part of the introduction. So in certain other fields, social scientific fields, you may have a whole separate section that's called problem statement. You might have your problem statement there. Yeah, so the formula, it was in the slideshow. My formula is one, it base your problem statement in your research questions. It should be intimately connected to your research questions. Okay, it should address your research questions. That's number one. Number two, there should be some statement that shows what kinds of research problems you're addressing, whether it's explicit or implicit, whether it's a paragraph or two in your introduction, or whether it's a whole separate section. You need to establish common ground, and then you need to include language that justifies the research, and then you need to link it to your primary argument, which is your overall argument of your research article. So those are the ingredients, and they're in the slideshow that I'm going to put on the course site that we were looking at earlier. And then, a literature review, that's the same thing. Some articles are going to have a separate section called a literature review. Others will not. Again, art history, philosophy, literary studies, they often do not have a literature review. In those examples of other articles that we were looking at a few weeks ago, there was no literature review in the marine biology article, but there were sources cited all throughout. So in some types of writing, you're going to engage in literature throughout the entire article, and in that case, you don't need a literature review section. You're just engaging with literature when it's relevant to your argument. But in more highly methodical social scientific fields, you may have a separate literature review. Same with the theoretical framework and the methodology. In some fields, you don't have a separate section for these. Sometimes they're built into the literature review. Sometimes they're built into the introduction. Sometimes you do have a separate section, right? And then you're not going to have results in a research proposal, but you are going to have objectives, a research design, a research plan, and a timeline. Okay. You may or may not have a budget. Some research is going to cost money, and you'll need funding. Some won't. You have hypotheses, anticipated outcomes. You don't have results, but you may have anticipations. You may have hypotheses. And then by presentations of results, and I'm going to change the language on this a little bit, because this is a template that I designed for my university for people who wanted to get a grant to do research in the summer term and not teach. So I'll change the language before I post it on our site and take out things like summer term and make it less specific to my institution. But you might need to say in your proposal how you intend to present your results. Is it going to be a conference paper? Are you going to submit an article for publication? Or are you going to write a book? What are you going to do with the results of your research? That should go in your proposal. And then obviously you want references in your proposal as well, just like you would have in an article. Okay. So citing references in a problem statement is the same as you would cite them anywhere else. You just use the citation style that your whatever style you've chosen to use, or whatever style you're obligated to use. Even if you do have a separate literature review, you can still cite literature in your introduction, in your methodology, in your problem statement. You can cite literature anywhere, even if you do use the MRAD format. But and you just cite it within the text the same way as you would anywhere else. Objectives into questions. Well, that's a good point. I think it's appropriate. It's, again, a research problem is the core. It's the motivation for the research questions, but it also is born out of preliminary research questions. And the objectives are going to be very dependent on the problem and the questions, because those are what provide the objectives, right? So you start asking questions. Those questions start to reveal a larger issue at hand. Maybe it's a gap of knowledge, maybe it's something else, but that larger issue becomes your research problem. Once you know what your research problem is, then you can more precisely write specific research questions that are going to help you address that research problem. Okay. But when you go back to why are you going to ask those questions? Why are you going to attempt to answer those questions? And how is that going to help resolve the problem? That's when you start to get this idea of what your objectives are. So they're all connected. So it is appropriate to some extent, but there also needs to be some separation between them, right? They have to they have a relationship with each other. But the heart and soul of the research is the problem. And that's what's the true motivation of it, right? Please share some well-written problem statement samples pertaining to linguistics and applied linguistics. Okay, that's a good idea. Maybe what we should do is start looking up some articles in the forum. We can share those. I'll go look for some, and let's all look for some where we feel like there's some good research problems, well-expressed research problems or problem statements, and then let's discuss those in the forum in the course site. Okay, another chat question, a general question. Nasir says that he has learned Americans use the pronoun I in research. We're here, we are encouraged to use the term the researcher. What's your take on that? That's an interesting question. The term I would be used in certain fields, but in certain fields in America, we would never use the term I, and other ones we would. So it depends on the field or the discipline that you're in. The same with passive voice. In some fields, you should use passive voice, in others, you should use active voice more often. I mean, there's always going to be a mixture. So it really depends on the epistemology of the field that you're in. Okay. In laboratory science, you won't say I. Even in America, they usually won't use the term I or the pronoun I. They will say we or the researchers, because in laboratory sciences, very often the results of research have to be replicated and they have to be seen by more than one person, because they're trying to eliminate subjectivity, right? So in fields like that, in chemistry or other fields where research is done in laboratories by big teams, they would probably avoid the first person pronoun and use we or the researchers. They would probably avoid singular pronouns, and they would probably use the passive voice whenever possible to avoid pronouns altogether. It was observed by the researchers. It was observed by the research team, right? In the humanities or in linguistics or in history or fields that allow for more subjectivity, because there is subjective truth. Not all truth is objective. Or let's say knowledge, right? Not all knowledge is objective. There's valid, valuable, subjective knowledge. You could argue that there is no objective knowledge and that we're just attempting to striving for it, but that's a philosophical argument. Fields that tolerate more subjective approaches might be fields where you'll see people using the term I. And maybe that is more of an American thing. Maybe in those exact same fields elsewhere, they would prefer not to use the first person pronoun and they would say something like the researcher. But it's definitely not across the board in America that people use I. Well, I've noticed it depends on your discipline and field. Research hypotheses, can they replace research questions? Well, not really. A hypothesis is not all research is going to have a hypothesis. Again, we're back to the question of what discipline you're in and what field you're in. in the more humanistic fields, again, I keep saying art history, but we could say art history, musicology, philosophy, literary studies. There's a lot of fields like that where people are not going to have hypotheses. They're going to be dealing with highly conceptual research problems, and they're going to be doing a lot of analysis, and they're not going to do a hypothesis that can be tested. But in other fields and other disciplines, the very nature of research may be that you formulate a hypothesis and then you test it. And in that case, no, the hypothesis does not replace the research questions. The research questions instead serve to demonstrate how you're going to test that hypothesis, right? Yes, the hypotheses, as Rabia is saying, you will find those in quantitative research. In qualitative research, you will often find that there's not even a need for a hypothesis. Are there a minimum or maximum number of references we should cite in a problem statement? No, there's no set number. You really just need to provide common ground, and you need to provide context. Place it in the context of your field and your colleagues. Question: in a problem statement, do we cite research done in local context versus literature reviews, where we cite the research done in similar contexts? Not necessarily. I would say in the problem statement, you simply provide a very broad picture of the context. And in the literature review, you provide very precise evidence of what the literature around your research topic says, right? So in your problem statement, you could say, despite a great need for us to answer these particular research questions, no one has ever done so adequately in this field. So that's very broad. The wording is broad. You might cite a source or two to demonstrate the truth of that, but you're staying broad, right? You're just using that breadth of summarizing the research in your topic in order to show the viability of your research problem. The literature review is where you actually demonstrate that you were indeed correct about that, because you do a review of all the literature and you show what has and hasn't been addressed, what has and hasn't been said, what studies are methodologically flawed, which ones support your argument, which ones support your justification for your research, and so forth. Yes, in applied linguistics, you can see a lot of research involving hypotheses. That's definitely a field where you would see that a hypothesis might be proposed, and then the research might respond to that hypothesis. Yes, significance of the research project or expected outcomes, depending on the nature of your project, could go into a proposal. Limitations of a theory can be named as research questions, yes. Okay, for example, Edward Said limited his Orientalism between the binary of America and Muslims of the Middle East. I have an objection to this idea where America had ever good relations with Saudi Arabia. What is a political controversy was taken as Orientalism. If I go beyond him, what would I name it? Yes, that could be a research question. That could be the core of a research problem. The broader problem there might be, what indeed is Orientalism? If Said's view of Orientalism is too narrow and it's too dependent on this binary between the Middle East, and again, when we say Orient, why is it limited to the Middle East? There's Asia beyond the Middle East, east of the Middle East. There's massive continent of Asia, and the difference between the culture in Afghanistan and the culture in Vietnam is immense. So, but they're both in Asia. They're both sort of subject to the analysis that we might glean from the theories of Orientalism. So you might be onto a bigger research problem there, which is, how do we reconceptualize Orientalism when the whole concept of it is dependent, or entirely too dependent, on an oversimplified binary? And even within that binary, there are different political relationships that don't necessarily have the work the same way. So I would say, it would take a lot of thought. I can't suggest what you would name this new concept, but that could be a good research problem. And there's so much other research that's been done about Orientalism that you could really place such a topic in, the midst of all those theories of Orientalism. Doesn't seem focused at the moment. It seems kind of broad, but that's where you start. And this goes back to the question of whether you have to have questions first or not. These are the kind of broad ideas and concepts that you might start with, and you might end up, after reading enough and thinking enough and asking and answering questions enough, then you might come up with a much more focused research problem, and then you might come up with much more specific research questions. So that's why, like I was saying earlier, it can be a chicken or an egg situation. No, I think research questions, again, they're not always explicitly stated. There's not always a section that says research questions. Sometimes there is, sometimes they're implicit, but I don't think the hypothesis and the questions are the same. The hypothesis is something that you, after much thought and much reading and a lot of preliminary work, you believe will be the case. But that's not the questions, right? The hypothesis is what you think the case is going to be once you put the conditions of the research into play, right? So to oversimplify it, I might say, my hypothesis is that I'm growing tomatoes. My hypothesis is that if I give them more nitrogen, the tomatoes will get bigger. Okay. So I have to set up a research. That hypothesis requires a research design, right? It requires a methodology. So then I have to have some tomatoes that don't get more nitrogen, some tomatoes that do, right? So I have to have a control group. Then once I've got the control groups, and I have to ask questions. What happens to the tomatoes without more nitrogen? What happens to the tomatoes with more nitrogen? How do we observe the growth in the tomatoes? Are there any other factors that weren't considered during the research design? For example, do they get the same amount of sunlight? Were there variables that we didn't know, that we overlooked? So there are all kinds of other questions that are going to come out of that research design. But the hypothesis is what you think is going to happen once you start that research, and once you implement those methods, and once you start observing the control group versus the other group, right? So you can't, a hypothesis is not going to preclude the need for research questions, in my opinion. Again, we're talking in very general terms here, and across different fields, you're going to have different expectations, different things that are acceptable, different things that are not acceptable in terms of methodologies. And so a lot of these questions don't have a single answer that's going to apply to everyone, but they, so you have to understand what the standards and expectations in your own field are. But no, I would not say a hypothesis means there shouldn't be any research questions, or they're not one and the same. You were told by one of your teachers that you cannot have questions and hypotheses at the same time. Stick to either or. Okay, I would disagree with that myself. But again, in the actual piece of writing you submit, you may not be required to write out and identify your research questions. if you are required to put the hypotheses in. Now, that is simply the kind of thing that might be a particular convention or a particular procedure within a certain field. But if we move beyond that, researching is asking questions and answering them. We don't always write out specific research questions, but sometimes we do. It depends on some publications require it. Some people that require you to submit research proposals will require it, and some will not. Some will say, write a hypothesis and put it in your research paper, but don't put the questions in. But that doesn't mean there are no questions. So when we move beyond the conventions of writing, which differ from one discipline and field to the next, and we go into the abstract conceptual side of this, research problems do still exist, whether we write them out in a separate section or not, whether they're implicit or whether they're overtly expressed, and the questions still exist. You can't have a hypothesis if you haven't been asking questions. And I mean that on the conceptual level, right? So somewhere along the line, you have to have some sort of inquisitiveness, some sort of inquiry that leads you to start wondering, well, what would happen if I do this versus that? And that's where the hypothesis, see, that's what a hypothesis is, right? I think if we give the tomatoes more nitrogen, they'll get bigger. And if we don't, they'll keep growing at the same rate. That's my hypothesis. But that, on an abstract conceptual level, had to be born out of some sort of curiosity and some sort of need to find something out. And those are still, in substance, questions of the sort. But whether you should write them all together in an article or not is a whole different story. That depends on your nature of your research, your field, and all those other sort of cultural expectations around the discourse community in which you participate. So all of this goes back to, there's a specific answer that's correct for your discourse community, and then there's the more abstract general answer, right? Okay, well, we've gone a bit over time. I do appreciate all of you being so energetic and attentive and staying for 90 minutes. I hope that you've enjoyed this session as much as I have. Are there any final comments or questions before we conclude? Okay, oh, excellent. I hope that you find some way to apply all of this and that it's been helpful. I will post the recording of this on the Moodle site soon, and the chat, because a lot of these questions that came up in the chat were excellent. There's good discussion there. I will post the sample student research proposal from an undergraduate. I will post the template for research proposal. You can use that template in the proposals you do for this class, but you don't have to, and the slideshow and everything else. I believe the deadline for the proposal is the end of February. I can't exactly remember, but if you go into the Moodle site, you will see in the workshop, there's two deadlines. There's one deadline to submit the proposal. Then there's a deadline to provide commentary on the proposals of two peers. So we're going to start doing a lot of, yes, I think February 10th is when the proposals due. And then you'll have like a week or something to read your colleagues' proposals and provide some commentary. I will be reading your proposals and providing commentary as well. And then from now on in this course, we're going to be doing these kinds of workshops where everybody's going to be writing things and sharing work. So the easy part of the course is now over, and the part where we're going to be doing a lot of writing and reading and commenting is about to begin. All right. Well, I will look forward to answering your discussions in the forums, and I'll post these materials, and I'll talk to you all soon. Take care and have a great evening.